You wake up and before your feet even touch the ground, something already feels off. Not because anything dramatic has happened, but because there is a quiet weight sitting inside your chest, a subtle pressure that whispers you are behind. You are late. You are not where you should be. And so you move through the morning the way you always have, checking your phone, scanning messages, stepping into a routine that feels familiar but strangely empty. And you tell yourself this is normal. This is just life. This is what everyone does. But let me ask you something that most people avoid asking themselves. If this is truly the life you were meant to live, then why does it feel like something is missing even when everything seems to be in place? Why does there remain this silent tension between who you are and who you sense you could become? And more importantly, where did that tension begin? There was a time long before responsibilities, long before expectations, when you did not question your significance, when you did not need permission to believe that your life held meaning. You did not measure yourself against others. You did not shrink your ambitions to fit into what was considered realistic. You simply existed with a quiet certainty that you were here for something. Not something vague, not something distant, but something real, something personal, something that belonged to you alone. And then slowly, without you even noticing, that certainty began to fade. Not because it was false, but because something else replaced it. You were introduced to a different story. A story that sounded reasonable, responsible, even wise. A story that told you life is about security, about stability, about following a path that has already been approved by those who came before you. You were taught to prepare rather than to pursue, to avoid risk rather than to embrace possibility, to wait rather than to act. And at first it seemed harmless because it was presented as guidance, as protection, as a way to ensure that you would not fail. But hidden inside that guidance was a subtle trade, a trade so quiet that most people never realize it happened. You traded your sense of mission for a sense of safety. And once that trade is made, everything begins to change. Not all at once, not in a way that alarms you, but gradually, almost invisibly, you begin to make decisions not based on what calls you forward, but based on what keeps you comfortable. You begin to filter your choices through fear disguised as logic. You begin to measure your potential against what seems possible instead of what feels true. And over time, the life you are building no longer reflects who you are. It reflects what you have been taught to accept. This is the lie that most people never question. The lie that says you are here to fit in, to follow instructions, to earn your place by conforming to expectations that were never designed with you in mind. The lie that tells you your role is to survive rather than to create, to comply rather than to lead, to wait for permission rather than to move with purpose. And because this lie is repeated so often, because it is reinforced by everyone around you, because it is wrapped in the language of responsibility and maturity, you begin to believe it not consciously, not intentionally, but deeply enough that it shapes how you see yourself. You begin to forget that you ever felt different. You begin to forget that there was once a part of you that refused to settle. A part of you that imagined more, that expected more, that believed more was possible. And instead, you adopt a new identity, one that feels acceptable, one that feels safe, one that does not draw too much attention. And you call it being realistic. You call it growing up. You call it understanding how the world works. But in truth, what you have done is something far more significant. You have stepped away from the very thing that made your life yours. And here is where it becomes dangerous. Not because something obvious goes wrong, but because everything appears to be working. You follow the path. You meet the expectations. You do what is required. And on the surface, it looks like progress. But beneath that surface, something continues to pull at you. A quiet dissatisfaction that you cannot fully explain. A sense that no matter how much you achieve within this structure, it never quite feels complete. And so you try to fix it by doing more, by working harder, by pushing yourself further along the same path, believing that the problem is not the direction, but your effort. And this is how years pass. You give your time, your energy, your focus to a life that was never aligned with your deeper purpose. And because you are committed, because you are disciplined, because you are willing to endure, you become very good at living a life that does not belong to you. And the more skilled you become at maintaining it, the harder it becomes to question it. Because to question it would mean confronting something uncomfortable. It would mean admitting that you may have been building in the wrong direction, that you may have been following a script that was handed to you without your awareness. Most people never reach that realization, not because they are incapable, but because they are too deeply immersed in the routine to step back and see it clearly. They continue forward adjusting small things, improving minor details, but never examining the foundation, never asking whether the structure itself was ever meant for them. And so they move through life with a constant undercurrent of unease, a feeling that something is off, but without the clarity to understand why. But you are here listening to this, which means something in you has not been completely silenced. Something in you still recognizes that there is more, that there has always been more, and that recognition is not accidental. It is not random. It is not something to ignore. It is the very thing that was buried under years of conditioning. The very thing that the world trained you to overlook. The very thing that you are now beginning to remember because the truth is simple even if it is not easy to accept. You were not sent here to follow a script. You were not sent here to spend your life reacting to circumstances that were designed by others. You were not sent here to trade your potential for comfort. You were sent here with something specific, something that requires your attention, your discipline, your commitment. And until you begin to acknowledge that, until you begin to question the life you have accepted as normal, that quiet tension inside you will remain not as a flaw, not as a weakness, but as a signal that you have not yet stepped into the life that was meant for you. From the moment you begin to become aware of the world, long before you have the ability to question it, something else begins to take shape inside you. Not your dreams, not your purpose, but your programming, a quiet, consistent shaping of how you see yourself, what you believe is possible, and what you accept as normal. And the most dangerous part is that it never feels like control. It feels like guidance. It feels like care. It feels like preparation for life. But in reality, it is something far more powerful. It is the construction of a mindset that will either limit you or liberate you, depending on whether you ever become aware of it. You are not told to obey directly. No one stands in front of you and commands you to shrink your thinking or silence your ambition. Instead, you are shown a model, a pattern repeated so often that it begins to feel unquestionable. You are rewarded for following instructions, for giving the right answers, for staying within the lines. And over time, you begin to associate approval with compliance. You begin to feel safe when you are aligned with expectations and uncomfortable when you are not. And this is how obedience is built, not through force, but through reinforcement. Think about how early it begins. You raise your hand before speaking. You wait to be called on. You learn that there is a correct answer, and that your role is to find it, not to challenge it. You are trained to memorize, to repeat, to perform, but rarely to create, rarely to question, rarely to step outside of what has already been defined. And while this system produces efficiency, it does something else quietly. It teaches you to look outward for direction instead of inward for purpose. And as you grow, this pattern does not disappear. It evolves. It becomes more sophisticated, more subtle. You are told to choose a path, but only from a predefined list. You are encouraged to think about your future, but only within the boundaries of what is considered practical. You are advised to follow your passion, but only if it aligns with stability, only if it does not disrupt the system you have been placed in. And so even your sense of freedom becomes structured. Even your choices are guided in ways that keep you within a certain range. Over time, you begin to internalize these limits, not as rules imposed on you, but as truths about the world. You start to believe that certain goals are unrealistic, that certain paths are too risky, that certain ideas are not meant for people like you. And this belief does not come from evidence. It comes from repetition. It comes from hearing the same warnings, the same cautions, the same narratives over and over again until they no longer feel like opinions. They feel like reality. This is how programming works. It does not need to be loud. It does not need to be obvious. It only needs to be consistent because the mind, especially the subconscious mind, accepts what is repeated with emotion as truth. It does not analyze deeply. It does not question authority. It absorbs. It records, and it builds patterns from what it is given. And once those patterns are established, they begin to guide your behavior automatically. You start to hesitate before taking risks, not because you have evaluated them fully, but because something inside you signals danger. You start to doubt your ideas before they are even tested. You start to seek validation before taking action. And all of this feels natural. It feels like you are being careful, like you are being responsible. But in reality, you are operating within a framework that was installed long before you had the awareness to choose it. And here is the deeper layer that most people never see. This programming is not only about what you do. It is about who you believe you are. It shapes your identity. It defines the boundaries of your self-image. It determines what you think you deserve, what you think you are capable of, and what you think is available to you. And once identity is shaped, behavior follows. Because you will always act in a way that is consistent with who you believe yourself to be. If you believe you are someone who must play it safe, you will avoid opportunities that require boldness. If you believe you are someone who is not meant to lead, you will step back even when you have the ability to step forward. If you believe that success belongs to a different kind of person, you will unconsciously limit your own progress. Not because you lack potential, but because your internal model does not allow you to see yourself in that position. This is why so many people remain stuck. not because they are incapable, but because they are conditioned. They are operating on instructions that were never consciously chosen. They are following patterns that were built through repetition, reinforced by environment, and protected by the illusion of normally. And as long as those patterns remain unexamined, they continue to run in the background, shaping decisions, influencing outcomes, and maintaining a life that feels predictable but unfulfilled. And yet, there is something remarkable about this process. Something that shifts everything the moment you understand it. The same mechanism that was used to program limitation can be used to create expansion. The same subconscious that accepted those beliefs without resistance can accept new ones if they are introduced with enough clarity, enough repetition, and enough conviction. Because the mind does not care whether a belief limits you or empowers you. It only cares how often it is reinforced and how strongly it is felt. This means that what you have accepted as fixed is not fixed. What you have believed to be your nature is not your nature. It is a pattern, and patterns can be changed, but only when they are first recognized. Only when you become aware that the thoughts you think automatically are not necessarily your own. That the fears you feel automatically are not necessarily valid. That the limits you perceive automatically are not necessarily real. And this is where the shift begins. Not with a dramatic external change, but with a quiet internal realization that you have been trained, that you have been shaped, that much of what you have accepted as truth was given to you without your conscious agreement. And once you see that, once you truly see it, something inside you begins to loosen. Something begins to open. Because if you were trained into this way of thinking, then you are not bound to remain in it. But awareness alone is not enough. Because the programming that shaped you is not created in a single moment. It was built over years of repetition, reinforced daily, strengthened through emotion and experience. Which means that changing it will require something just as consistent, just as deliberate, just as persistent. And that is where most people stop. They recognize the pattern, but they do not commit to rewriting it. They see the cage, but they do not walk out of it. Because walking out requires something uncomfortable. It requires you to think differently before you feel ready, to act differently before you feel confident, to believe something new before you have proof. And this goes against everything the old programming has taught you. It creates resistance. It creates doubt. It creates friction. But that friction is not a sign that you are wrong. It is a sign that you are stepping outside of the system that was designed to keep you where you are. And the moment you begin to question what you were taught, the moment you begin to choose your thoughts instead of repeating them, the moment you begin to act based on purpose instead of conditioning, you are no longer simply reacting to life. You are beginning to shape it. You are beginning to reclaim something that was always yours, but was slowly taken from you without your awareness. And once that process begins, it does not reverse easily because you can no longer pretend that you do not see what has been shaping you all along. There are no chains around your wrists, no visible barriers stopping you from moving forward, no one standing in your way telling you that you cannot become more. And yet day after day, year after year, most people remain exactly where they are, repeating the same patterns, living within the same limits, circling the same frustrations, and calling it life. And if you look closely, not at what is visible, but at what is quietly shaping their choices, you begin to notice something far more powerful than force, something far more effective than restriction, something that does not need to control you physically because it has already conditioned you mentally. The first of these chains is ease. Not comfort in its healthy form, but a subtle addiction to what requires the least resistance, the least effort, the least discomfort. Because the human mind is designed to conserve energy, to avoid strain, to seek the path that feels smooth and predictable. And in a world that constantly offers convenience, speed, and instant relief, that tendency becomes amplified. It becomes a default setting. And before you realize it, you begin to choose what is easy over what is necessary, what is comfortable over what is meaningful, what is immediate over what is valuable. You delay action because it feels inconvenient. You avoid difficulty because it feels uncomfortable. You postpone growth because it requires effort. And each time you make that choice, it seems small. It seems harmless. It seems justified. But what you are actually doing is reinforcing a pattern that slowly trains your mind to resist anything that challenges it, anything that stretches it, anything that demands more from you than what you are used to giving. And over time, this pattern becomes so ingrained that you no longer question it. You simply follow it and you call it your preference, your personality, your way of being without realizing that it is nothing more than a conditioned response. And here is where it becomes dangerous because ease does not present itself as a problem. It presents itself as relief. It tells you that you deserve to rest, that you should take it slow, that you have time. And while there is truth in rest, while there is value in balance, what ease quietly does is it removes the urgency from your life, it dulls your sense of purpose. It makes tomorrow feel just as acceptable as today. And when urgency disappears, action disappears with it. And when action disappears, potential remains unrealized. The second chain is debt. And this goes far beyond money. Although financial debt plays a powerful role in limiting freedom because when you owe, you are no longer fully in control. Your decisions are influenced by obligations. Your choices are narrowed by necessity. Your risks are calculated not based on opportunity, but on survival. And this creates a form of dependency, a subtle but constant pressure that keeps you tied to a system that may not serve you, but that you cannot easily leave. But there is also another kind of debt, a psychological debt, a debt of expectation, where you feel obligated to meet the standards that have been set for you, to fulfill roles that were assigned to you, to live in a way that satisfies others even if it disconnects you from yourself. And this kind of debt is often invisible because it is not written down. It is not quantified, but it is felt. It is carried in the decisions you make, in the paths you choose, in the opportunities you decline, not because you do not want them, but because they do not align with what you believe you owe to the world around you. And when you combine ease with debt, something powerful happens. You begin to prioritize what is safe over what is significant. You begin to protect what you have instead of pursuing what you could create. You begin to manage your life instead of expanding it. And all of this feels responsible. It feels mature. It feels like you are doing the right thing. But beneath that surface, there is a quiet compromise taking place. A compromise between the life you are maintaining and the life you are capable of building. The third chain is false belief, and this is perhaps the most powerful of all, because while ease influences your actions and debt influences your decisions, belief influences your identity. It determines what you think is possible before you even attempt it. It sets the boundaries of your ambition. It shapes the way you interpret failure, success, risk, and opportunity. And once a belief is accepted, it does not need to be enforced. It enforces itself. If you believe that success is rare, you will treat it as something distant, something reserved for others. If you believe that failure is dangerous, you will avoid situations where growth is possible. If you believe that you are not ready, you will wait indefinitely for a moment that never arrives. And each of these beliefs operates quietly, without announcement, without resistance, guiding your behavior in ways that feel natural but are anything but neutral. False beliefs are not always obvious. They often disguise themselves as logic, less realism, as experience. They are supported by examples, by stories, by observations that seem to confirm them. And because of that, they are rarely challenged. They are accepted, repeated, and reinforced until they become part of your internal dialogue, shaping how you speak to yourself, how you evaluate your progress, how you respond to setbacks, and most importantly, how you define your limits. And when these three chains work together, ease, debt, and false belief, they create a system that is incredibly difficult to escape because it does not feel like a prison. It feels like life. It feels normal. It feels familiar. And that familiarity is what keeps it in place because you do not question what you have accepted as standard. You do not resist what you have adapted to. You do not challenge what you have internalized. You wake up. You follow your routine. You make your decisions based on what feels manageable, what feels expected, what feels safe. And in doing so, you continue to reinforce the very patterns that keep you where you are. Not because you lack the ability to move beyond them, but because you have not yet disrupted the system that sustains them. But the moment you begin to see these chains for what they are, not as permanent conditions, but as constructed patterns, something shifts. Because what is constructed can be deconstructed. What is learned can be unlearned, and what is repeated can be replaced. But only if you are willing to confront the discomfort that comes with breaking away from what is familiar. Because breaking away from ease means choosing effort when it is easier not to. Breaking away from debt means reclaiming control over your decisions even when it requires sacrifice. And breaking away from false belief means questioning the very thoughts that have guided you for years. And that process is not comfortable. It is not immediate. It is not effortless. But it is necessary. And as you begin to challenge these patterns, as you begin to act differently, think differently, and choose differently, you will notice resistance, not only from within yourself, but from the environment around you. Because anything that disrupts a system will be met with pressure to return to it. But that pressure is not a signal to stop. It is a confirmation that you are stepping outside of what once controlled you. And once you step outside even slightly, even imperfectly, you begin to experience something that was not available to you before. Not because it did not exist, but because you were not aligned with it. You begin to experience movement, direction, possibility, not as distant concepts, but as immediate realities. And that experience changes everything because it shows you that the limits you once accepted were never absolute. They were conditional. And conditions can change. There is a moment in almost every life that no one talks about. Not because it is rare, but because it is so common that it has been mistaken for normal. A moment where a person does not fail, does not collapse, does not lose everything in some dramatic way, but instead quietly surrenders, not to circumstances, not to a specific event, but to a way of living that slowly replaces who they could have become with who they are willing to accept. And the most dangerous part is that this surrender does not feel like defeat. It feels like maturity. It feels like responsibility. It feels like finally understanding how the world works. You can see it in the shift that happens over time, where ambition begins to soften, where bold ideas begin to sound unrealistic, where risk begins to feel unnecessary. And what was once a desire to build, to create, to expand is gradually replaced with a desire to maintain, to protect, to avoid loss. And on the surface, this looks like growth. It looks like becoming wiser, more grounded, more practical. But beneath that surface, something else is taking place, something far more permanent. The gradual shrinking of possibility. At first, the surrender is subtle. It shows up in small decisions. You decide not to take a chance because the timing is not right. You decide not to speak up because it might create tension. You decide not to pursue something because it seems uncertain. And each of these decisions feels justified. It feels logical. It feels safe. But what you do not realize is that you are not just avoiding risk. You are conditioning your mind to associate discomfort with danger. You are training yourself to retreat instead of advance, to hesitate instead of act. And over time, this pattern becomes automatic. And once it becomes automatic, something changes in the way you see yourself. You begin to identify with caution. You begin to define yourself by what you avoid rather than what you pursue. You begin to build an identity around stability, around predictability, around staying within limits. And because this identity is reinforced by your environment, by the people around you who are making similar choices, by a culture that rewards consistency over creativity, you begin to feel validated in your surrender. This is why most people never recognize the moment it happens, because it is not presented as a loss. It is presented as progress. It is celebrated, encouraged, reinforced. And by the time the consequences become visible, by the time the sense of stagnation becomes undeniable, by the time the quiet dissatisfaction turns into something harder to ignore, the pattern has already been established. The identity has already been formed, and breaking away from it feels far more difficult than staying within it. But the deeper reason why this surrender happens has little to do with external pressure and everything to do with internal belief. Because long before a person stops taking action, they stop believing in what is possible for them. They begin to doubt not just the outcome, but their own capacity to create it. And once that doubt takes hold, action becomes inconsistent, effort becomes conditional, and eventually pursuit becomes optional. The mind, when filled with uncertainty, seeks resolution. It looks for evidence. It looks for proof. And when it does not find immediate confirmation that success is guaranteed, it begins to withdraw. It begins to protect itself from potential failure, from potential embarrassment, from potential loss. And in doing so, it convinces you that stepping back is the intelligent choice, that waiting is the responsible choice, that staying where you are is the safe choice. But what is rarely understood is that this form of safety comes with a cost that is not immediate, not obvious, but cumulative, because every time you choose not to act, every time you choose not to move forward, every time you choose not to pursue what calls you, you are not just avoiding failure. You are also avoiding growth. You are avoiding experience. You are avoiding the very process that would have expanded your capacity and strengthened your belief. And so over time, the absence of action becomes the absence of evidence. And the absence of evidence reinforces the doubt, creating a cycle that feeds itself. You do not act because you do not believe. And you do not believe because you have not acted. And within that cycle, surrender becomes inevitable. Not because you are incapable, but because you have gradually disconnected from the part of yourself that was willing to try. There is also another force at work, one that is less obvious, but equally powerful, the influence of time. Because as the years pass, the stakes begin to feel higher. The responsibilities begin to increase. The margin for error begins to feel smaller. And what might have once felt like an opportunity now feels like a risk. What might have once felt like a possibility now feels like a threat. And this shift in perception makes it even easier to justify inaction. To justify staying within the known. To justify maintaining what you have instead of pursuing what you could build. And yet beneath all of this, beneath the logic, beneath the reasoning, beneath the justifications, there remains a quiet awareness, a sense that something has been left behind, that something has not been fully expressed, that the life you are living, while functional, while acceptable, while even successful by certain standards, does not fully reflect what you are capable of. And this awareness does not disappear. It lingers. It resurfaces in moments of stillness, in moments of reflection, in moments where you are not distracted by routine. Most people ignore it, not because they do not feel it, but because acknowledging it would require a confrontation. A confrontation with the choices they have made, with the paths they have taken, with the version of themselves they have become. And that confrontation is uncomfortable. It challenges the identity they have built. It questions the direction they have followed. And so it is easier to silence it, to push it aside, to return to what is familiar. But for those who do not ignore it, for those who allow themselves to sit with that awareness, to explore it, to question it, something begins to change. Because in that awareness lies the recognition that surrender was not a necessity. It was a decision. Not a single decision made in one moment, but a series of decisions made over time. Each one small, each one justified, each one reinforcing the next until the pattern became a path. And if surrender was built through decisions, then it can be undone through decisions. Not through a single dramatic shift, not through a sudden transformation, but through a deliberate choice to begin again. To act where you once hesitated, to pursue where you once avoided, to believe where you once doubted. And while this does not erase the past, it changes the direction of the future. Because the truth is life does not end when you surrender. It continues. It moves forward. It carries you with it. But the difference between a life that is lived fully and a life that is merely maintained is determined by whether you continue to follow the pattern of surrender or whether you interrupt it. Whether you continue to accept the limits that have been placed on you or whether you begin to question them. And that question, simple as it may seem, is where everything begins to shift. There is a law operating within you at all times, whether you are aware of it or not. A law that does not ask for your permission, does not require your understanding, and does not pause simply because you choose to ignore it. A law that quietly governs the direction of your life through something far more subtle than action alone. Through the thoughts you allow, the words you repeat, and the identity you accept as your own. And once you begin to see how this law works, you begin to understand that your life has not been shaped by chance, but by a process that has been running in the background of your mind for years. Every thought you entertain, especially the ones you repeat with emotion, leaves an imprint, not just as a passing idea, but as a suggestion, a command delivered to the deeper part of your mind that does not question, that does not argue, that simply receives and acts. And this is where most people misunderstand the nature of their own thinking. They believe that thoughts are temporary, that they come and go without consequence. But the truth is that repeated thoughts become instructions, and instructions, when accepted, become patterns, and patterns, when reinforced, become identity. If you consistently think in terms of limitation, if you repeatedly tell yourself that you are not ready, that you are not capable, that circumstances are against you, those thoughts do not remain harmless. They accumulate, they settle, they begin to define the way you see yourself in the world. And once that definition is established, your behavior aligns with it. Not because you consciously choose it, but because you are acting in accordance with what you believe to be true. This is the law of inner command. The principle that your subconscious mind responds to the dominant thoughts you feed it. And it does so without discrimination, without judgment. It does not decide whether a thought is beneficial or harmful. It only recognizes repetition and emotional intensity. And whatever is repeated often enough with enough conviction becomes accepted as reality within you. And once it is accepted, it begins to influence your actions, your decisions, your habits, and ultimately your results. This is why two individuals with similar circumstances can produce entirely different outcomes. Not because one is inherently more capable than the other, but because one has conditioned their mind to expect growth, to pursue opportunity, to persist in the face of difficulty, while the other has conditioned their mind to anticipate obstacles, to avoid risk, to withdraw when challenged. And each of them is simply acting out the commands that have been reinforced within them over time. What most people fail to realize is that this process is happening continuously, not just in moments of intention, but in the quiet repetition of everyday thought, in the casual statements you make about yourself, in the assumptions you hold about what is possible, in the way you interpret success and failure. And because these patterns are familiar, because they feel natural, they are rarely questioned. They are accepted as part of your personality, when in reality, they are the result of conditioning. But the moment you become aware of this law, the moment you recognize that your thoughts are not passive, that they are active forces shaping your identity, you are presented with a choice. A choice that most people overlook. You can continue to allow your mind to operate on patterns that were installed without your awareness. Or you can begin to take control of what is being repeated, what is being reinforced, what is being accepted as truth. And this is where repetition becomes a tool rather than a trap. Because just as negative patterns were built through repetition, empowering patterns can be built the same way. Not through occasional effort, not through temporary motivation, but through consistent, deliberate reinforcement of thoughts that align with the person you intend to become. And this requires something that goes against your current conditioning. It requires you to think in advance of evidence, to believe before results appear, to act as if what you are building is already in motion, even when external proof has not yet caught up. This is not about pretending. It is not about ignoring reality. It is about understanding that reality itself is influenced by the internal framework through which you perceive and respond to it. And when that framework changes, when your dominant thoughts shift from doubt to direction, from hesitation to commitment, your actions begin to reflect that shift. And over time, those actions produce outcomes that reinforce the new identity you are building. Identity is not something fixed. It is not something you are born with and cannot change. It is something that is constructed, something that is shaped by what you repeatedly tell yourself about who you are. And once an identity is formed, it becomes the filter through which you interpret everything. It determines what you notice, what you pursue, what you avoid, and what you believe you deserve. And this is why changing behavior alone is not enough. Because if your identity remains unchanged, your behavior will eventually return to what is familiar. If you see yourself as someone who lacks discipline, you will struggle to maintain consistent action. Even if you begin with strong intention, if you see yourself as someone who is not capable of achieving a certain level of success, you will unconsciously limit your effort, your vision, your persistence. Not because you are unwilling, but because your internal definition does not support that outcome. And until that definition changes, progress will always feel temporary. But when you begin to deliberately construct a new identity, when you begin to define yourself based on the direction you are choosing rather than the results you have already produced, something shifts. You no longer wait to feel confident before acting. You act in a way that builds confidence. You no longer wait for external validation to believe in yourself. You generate that belief internally through repetition, through discipline, through consistent alignment between what you think, what you say, and what you do. This is where the power of inner command becomes evident because you are no longer reacting to circumstances. You are directing your own development. You are choosing the thoughts that dominate your mind. You are reinforcing the beliefs that support your growth. And you are acting in a way that is consistent with the identity you are creating. And while this process is not immediate, while it requires persistence, patience, and discipline, it is reliable because it is based on a principle that does not change. The mind will accept what is repeated. The identity will reflect what is accepted. And the life you experience will follow the identity you have constructed. And once you understand this, once you truly grasp that your internal dialogue is not just commentary but command, you begin to see that the direction of your life is not determined by what has happened to you, but by what you consistently tell yourself about who you are and what you are capable of becoming. Long before the world calls someone successful, before recognition, before results, before any visible proof appears, there is always a period that most people never see. A period where belief exists without evidence, where vision exists without validation, where action is taken in the absence of certainty. And it is within this invisible phase that power is built. Not the kind of power that is given by position or status, but the kind that is developed internally through clarity of purpose, through disciplined thought, and through the refusal to surrender to doubt when there is nothing external to confirm that success is possible. If you study the lives of those who shaped industries, who altered the direction of economies, who built systems that continued to produce value long after their initial effort, you begin to notice a pattern that is impossible to ignore. They did not wait for belief to be supported by results. They created belief first. They committed to an idea before it was accepted, before it was proven, before it was understood by others. And this commitment was not casual. It was not temporary. It was sustained, reinforced daily through thought, through action, through repetition that aligned their identity with the outcome they intended to produce. Consider the individual who began with nothing more than a clear purpose to organize industry in a way that had never been done before, who saw not just the process of producing goods, but the system behind it, the structure that could operate continuously, efficiently, and independently of constant supervision. And while others focused on immediate effort on exchanging time for income, he focused on building mechanisms that would continue to generate value even in his absence. And at the time, this idea was not widely understood. It was not immediately accepted. It required a level of belief that extended beyond what was visible, beyond what was conventional, beyond what seemed practical. Or think of the man who insisted that what appeared impossible could be made simple through persistent experimentation, who faced repeated failure not as a signal to stop, but as information to refine his approach, who maintained a vision so clear that each unsuccessful attempt became part of the process rather than a reason to abandon it. And while others questioned his direction, while others saw only setbacks, he saw progress because his belief was not dependent on immediate results. It was rooted in a decision that had already been made internally. There was also the individual who understood the relationship between thought and wealth at a level that few others considered, who recognized that resources alone do not create abundance, but that the organization of ideas, the coordination of effort, and the alignment of purpose could transform opportunity into sustained success. And he operated with a discipline that extended beyond action into thought itself, carefully directing his attention, his focus, and his mental habits in a way that supported the outcome he intended to achieve, even when external conditions were uncertain. What connects these individuals is not simply ambition, not simply intelligence, not simply opportunity, but a principle that is often overlooked. They acted as if the result was inevitable long before it became visible. Not in a reckless way, not in a detached way, but in a disciplined, deliberate manner that aligned their daily behavior with their long-term vision. And this alignment created momentum, not because the world immediately responded, but because their internal state remained consistent regardless of external feedback. This is where most people separate themselves from those who build lasting power. Not in the size of their ideas, not in the availability of opportunity, but in the timing of their belief. Because the average person waits for evidence before committing, waits for validation before persisting, waits for certainty before acting, and in doing so, they delay the very process that would produce the evidence they are looking for. They remain in a state of hesitation, of conditional effort, of partial commitment, and as a result their progress remains limited. The individuals who build systems, who create value that extends beyond their immediate presence, who influence outcomes on a larger scale, operate differently. They decide first. They commit internally, and then they structure their thoughts and actions in a way that supports that decision regardless of how long it takes for external results to appear. And this consistency is what separates temporary effort from sustained achievement. It is important to understand that this does not mean they are free from doubt. It does not mean they never question their direction. But it does mean that their commitment is not controlled by those doubts. It means that their actions are guided by purpose rather than by temporary emotion. And over time, this creates a level of stability, a level of focus, a level of persistence that allows them to continue moving forward while others stop. They do not rely on motivation because motivation is inconsistent. They rely on structure, on systems, on habits that reinforce their direction daily. They do not depend on external approval because approval is unpredictable. They depend on internal alignment, on a clear understanding of what they are building and why. And this clarity allows them to maintain their course even when there is no immediate reward. What you begin to see when you study this pattern is that success in its most consistent form is not the result of isolated effort, but of organized thinking, repeated action, and a belief that is maintained long enough to become reality. And this belief is not passive. It is active. It is reinforced through repetition, through visualization, through constant attention to the objective, and through the refusal to allow temporary setbacks to redefine the outcome. And this brings you to a realization that changes how you view your own path. Because if these individuals began without certainty, without widespread support, without immediate results, then the absence of those conditions in your own life is not a barrier. It is simply part of the process. It is the phase where belief must be established internally before it can be reflected externally. The question is not whether the world believes in what you are building, not whether others understand your direction, not whether there is immediate evidence to support your vision. The question is whether you are willing to establish that belief within yourself first. Whether you are willing to organize your thoughts, your actions, and your identity around a purpose that has not yet been confirmed by results. And whether you are willing to maintain that alignment long enough for it to produce something tangible. Because the individuals who built power did not wait for the world to agree with them. They developed the capacity to agree with themselves, to reinforce that agreement daily, and to act in accordance with it until the results could no longer be ignored. And once that process was complete, once the internal had been translated into the external, what appeared to others as sudden success was in fact the outcome of a sustained period of unseen discipline, directed thought, and unwavering commitment to a purpose that existed long before the world chose to recognize it. At a certain point in life, Whether you acknowledge it consciously or not, you arrive at a divide. Not a dramatic crossroads marked by a clear decision. Not a moment announced with certainty, but a quiet separation that reveals itself through your daily choices, your habits, your priorities, and the way you respond to what is in front of you. And this divide leads to two very different paths. Two ways of living that may look similar on the surface, but produce entirely different outcomes over time. One path shaped by obedience, the other defined by mission. The path of obedience is not forced upon you. It is presented to you as the natural way, the expected way, the responsible way. It is the path you have already been prepared for. The one that aligns with the patterns you have been taught. The one that rewards consistency, predictability, and compliance. And it begins subtly with the decision to follow what is familiar, to choose what is approved, to prioritize stability over possibility. And at first it feels comfortable. It feels secure. It feels like you are doing what is right on this path. Your life is structured around external expectations. Your time is organized by obligations. Your goals are defined by standards that were set before you ever question them. And your progress is measured by how well you meet those standards, how effectively you perform within the system you are part of. And because there is a clear structure, because there are clear rules, because there is a clear sequence to follow, it removes the uncertainty that comes with independent thinking. It removes the pressure of having to define your own direction. But over time, something begins to shift, not in a way that is immediately obvious, but in a way that gradually becomes more difficult to ignore. Because while this path provides stability, it also limits expansion. While it offers security, it restricts possibility. And while it gives you a sense of order, it takes away a sense of ownership. And the longer you remain on this path, the more your life becomes a reflection of the system you are operating within rather than the potential you carry within yourself. You begin to notice that your efforts, no matter how consistent, are tied to a structure that determines their value. That your time is exchanged rather than multiplied. That your growth is incremental rather than exponential. And while there is nothing inherently wrong with progress, there is something limiting about a path that does not allow you to fully express what you are capable of creating. And this realization, when it appears, often brings with it a quiet dissatisfaction. A sense that something is missing even when everything seems to be in place. The path of mission, on the other hand, does not begin with clarity. It begins with a decision. A decision to take ownership of your direction, to define your purpose rather than inherit it. To move based on what you believe you are meant to build rather than what you have been told to maintain. And unlike the path of obedience, it does not offer immediate structure. It does not provide clear instructions. It does not guarantee certainty. And this is why so few choose it. Because the path of mission requires something that the other path does not. It requires you to act without complete assurance. To think beyond what has been proven. To step into a space where results are not immediate and validation is not guaranteed. And in that space, your belief becomes the foundation. Your discipline becomes the structure, and your persistence becomes the force that carries you forward. On this path, you are no longer exchanging time for stability. You are investing time into creation. You are building systems rather than maintaining positions. You are organizing your efforts in a way that compounds rather than repeats. And while the early stages may appear uncertain, while the progress may not be immediately visible, what you are doing is fundamentally different because you are not operating within limits. You are expanding them. This path requires you to think in terms of long-term impact rather than short-term comfort. To prioritize growth over ease. To accept that discomfort is not a signal to stop, but a condition of expansion. And as you continue, as you align your thoughts, your actions, and your identity with your mission, something begins to take shape. Not instantly, not dramatically, but steadily, consistently as a result of your commitment. And here is where the contrast between these two paths becomes undeniable. Because while the path of obedience maintains what already exists, the path of mission creates what did not exist before. While one keeps you within a defined range, the other allows you to extend beyond it. While one depends on external structure, the other builds internal strength. And over time, these differences compound. They expand. They become more visible. Not just in results, but in the way you experience your life. The individual on the path of obedience may achieve stability, may achieve consistency, may achieve a level of comfort, but often at the cost of autonomy, at the cost of expression, at the cost of realizing their full capacity. While the individual on the path of mission may face uncertainty, may encounter difficulty, may experience periods of doubt, but in exchange they gain something that cannot be given externally. They gain ownership. They gain direction. They gain the ability to shape their life based on what they choose to build rather than what they are told to follow. This is not a judgment between right and wrong. It is a distinction between outcomes because both paths require effort. Both paths demand time. Both paths involve commitment, but they lead to different forms of life. One defined by structure, the other defined by creation, one sustained by compliance, the other driven by purpose. And the path you find yourself on is not determined by circumstance, but by decision, by the choices you make repeatedly, by the direction you reinforce daily. Most people do not choose the path of obedience once. They choose it repeatedly in small moments, in subtle decisions, in ways that feel insignificant at the time, but accumulate into a pattern. And the same is true for the path of mission. It is not chosen in a single declaration. It is chosen in consistent alignment, in the willingness to act in accordance with a purpose even when it is not convenient, even when it is not easy, even when it is not immediately rewarded. And as you become aware of these two paths, as you begin to see the patterns that define them, the question is no longer abstract. It becomes personal. It becomes immediate because every decision you make contributes to one or the other. Every action you take reinforces a direction. Every thought you repeat strengthens an identity. And over time, those decisions, those actions, those thoughts form the path you walk. Whether you intended it or not, there comes a point where understanding is no longer enough. Where awareness without action becomes another form of delay, another layer of comfort disguised as progress. And this is where most people pause, not because they lack clarity, but because they hesitate to let go of what is familiar. They hesitate to release the structure that has defined them for so long, even if that structure has limited them, even if it has kept them from stepping into something greater. And this hesitation is not weakness. It is the natural response of a mind that has been trained to preserve what it knows rather than risk what it does not. But if there is to be a true shift, not a temporary change, not a brief moment of motivation, but a complete transformation, something more decisive is required, something that goes beyond adjusting habits or refining behavior, something that reaches into the foundation of how you see yourself and how you operate within the world. And that is the moment where you no longer try to improve the old version of your life. You make the decision to release it entirely. The old blueprint is not just your routine. It is your assumptions, your expectations, your definitions of what is possible and what is not. It is the mental structure that has guided your choices, shaped your actions, and limited your vision. And as long as you continue to operate within that blueprint, even if you make small improvements, even if you add discipline, even if you increase effort, you will remain within the same framework, producing variations of the same results. To burn the old blueprint does not mean to reject everything you have learned. It means to question everything that has defined you, to examine the beliefs that have shaped your identity, to challenge the limits that you have accepted as real, and to recognize that many of the rules you have been following were never absolute. They were adopted, repeated, and reinforced until they felt permanent. And once you see that, you begin to understand that what has been constructed can be reconstructed. This is where the concept of walking as one scent begins to take form, not as an idea, not as a phrase, but as a way of being. A shift in identity where you no longer move through life as someone waiting for permission, waiting for confirmation, waiting for certainty, but as someone who operates with a sense of direction that comes from within, a sense of purpose that is not dependent on external validation, and a level of commitment that does not fluctuate based on temporary conditions. To walk as one scent is to act as if your presence here has meaning, not in a vague or abstract sense, but in a specific actionable way. It is to approach your decisions, your actions, your time with the understanding that it is not unlimited, that it is not to be spent reacting to circumstances, but to be invested in building something that reflects who you are becoming. And this shift changes everything because it removes hesitation. It removes the need to justify your direction to others. It removes the dependency on approval. But this shift is not comfortable because it requires you to detach from the identity you have been reinforcing for years. It requires you to act differently before you feel different, to think differently before it feels natural, to hold a vision that is not yet supported by your current reality. And this creates tension. It creates doubt. It creates resistance not only within you, but often from those around you. Because any change that moves you outside of what is expected will challenge the patterns that others have accepted. And yet, this is precisely the point where transformation becomes possible. Because as long as you remain within what is expected, you remain within what is predictable. And if you want a different outcome, you must be willing to step into a different way of operating. One that is guided by purpose rather than by habit, by direction rather than by reaction, by internal command rather than external influence. Burning the old blueprint is not a single act. It is a process, a continuous decision to reject the thoughts that limit you, to replace the patterns that confine you, to align your actions with the identity you are choosing to build. And this process requires repetition. It requires discipline. It requires a level of commitment that does not depend on how you feel in the moment. Because there will be moments where the old patterns try to return, where the familiar thoughts resurface, where the easier path presents itself again. In those moments, the difference is not in what you feel, but in what you choose. Because feeling uncertain does not mean you are on the wrong path. Feeling resistance does not mean you should stop. It means you are moving beyond what you have known. And growth always carries a level of discomfort because it requires you to expand beyond your current identity to operate in a space where you are not yet fully established. As you continue, as you reinforce this new way of thinking and acting, something begins to stabilize. The unfamiliar becomes familiar. The effort becomes natural. The identity you are building begins to feel real. Not because you have reached a final point, but because you have consistently aligned your actions with it. And this alignment creates a form of certainty that does not depend on immediate results. It is based on the understanding that you are moving in the direction you have chosen regardless of how long it takes. And this is where the shift becomes undeniable because you are no longer trying to fit your life into an existing structure. You are creating your own. You are no longer waiting for conditions to be perfect. You are acting within the conditions that exist, shaping them through your decisions, your persistence, your discipline. And while the external world may not change immediately, your relationship to it does. You begin to see opportunities where you once saw limitations. You begin to take action where you once hesitated. You begin to move with intention rather than with uncertainty. Walking as one sent is not about arrogance. It is not about believing you are above others. It is about recognizing that your life carries responsibility, that your time carries weight, that your potential carries obligation. And that obligation is not to conform, but to create, not to follow, but to lead in your own direction. And once you accept that responsibility, once you step into that identity, the way you move through life changes. Not in isolated moments, but consistently, deliberately, in a way that reflects a decision that has already been made. Because once the old blueprint is no longer guiding you, once you have committed to a new way of thinking, a new way of acting, a new way of being, there is no return to what was comfortable. Not because it is no longer available, but because it no longer aligns with who you are choosing to become. Transformation does not happen in a single moment. It does not arrive as a sudden breakthrough that changes everything overnight. It is built in repetition, in structure, in the quiet discipline of what you do daily when no one is watching. And this is where most people misunderstand the process. They search for intensity instead of consistency. They wait for motivation instead of building systems. They look for a turning point while ignoring the power of what is repeated every single day. And because of that, they experience temporary change, but never permanent transformation. If you are to become someone different, if you are to move from the identity that was shaped by conditioning into one that is directed by purpose, you must create a structure that reinforces that identity daily. Not occasionally, not when you feel ready, but regardless of how you feel. Because identity is not formed through intention alone. It is formed through action that is repeated until it becomes natural, until it becomes automatic, until it no longer requires effort to maintain. This is where the concept of a daily ritual becomes essential. Not as a routine for productivity, but as a system for rebirth, a process through which you rebuild your mind, strengthen your body, align with your mission, and create space for clarity. And each of these elements is not separate. They are connected. They reinforce each other. They create a foundation that supports growth, discipline, and direction. The first element is the mind because everything begins there before any action is taken, before any result is produced. Your thoughts determine the direction of your energy. And if those thoughts are left unmanaged, they will default to what has been programmed over time. They will return to doubt, to limitation, to hesitation. And this is why you must begin each day by taking control of what enters your mind. Not passively, but deliberately by choosing the thoughts you will reinforce. By repeating statements that align with the identity you are building, not as empty words, but as commands that you deliver to your subconscious with clarity and conviction. You do not wait to feel confident. You generate confidence through repetition. You do not wait to believe. You build belief through consistency. And as you repeat these thoughts daily, as you visualize the direction you are moving toward, as you speak to yourself in a way that reflects who you are becoming rather than who you have been, you begin to shift the internal framework that guides your actions. And over time, this shift becomes stable. It becomes part of how you think without conscious effort. The second element is the body because the state of your body influences the state of your mind. And a mind that is disciplined requires a body that is conditioned to handle effort, discomfort, and strain. And this is not about appearance. It is not about external validation. It is about control. It is about proving to yourself that you can act regardless of resistance. that you can push beyond what feels comfortable, that you can maintain discipline even when it would be easier to stop. Physical training becomes more than exercise. It becomes a demonstration of your ability to follow through, to endure, to persist. And each time you do what is difficult, each time you choose effort over ease, you reinforce an identity of strength, not only physically, but mentally, because the same discipline that allows you to push your body forward transfers into how you approach your work, your goals, your decisions. The third element is mission, because without direction, effort becomes scattered, energy becomes unfocused, and discipline loses its purpose. And this is where you must define what you are building. Not in vague terms, not in distant ideas, but in clear actionable steps that move you forward each day, regardless of scale, regardless of speed. Because progress is not measured by how quickly you move, but by whether you are consistently moving in the right direction each day. You must engage with your mission. You must take action that contributes to it, even if it is small, even if it feels insignificant. Because consistency compounds, and what seems minor in the moment becomes significant over time. And as you continue to align your actions with your purpose, you create momentum, not through intensity, but through repetition, through the accumulation of effort that builds over days, weeks, and months. The fourth element is stillness. And this is often the most overlooked because in a world filled with noise, distraction, and constant input, silence feels unfamiliar. It feels unproductive. It feels unnecessary. But it is within stillness that clarity emerges. It is within silence that you are able to observe your thoughts without reacting to them, to separate what is real from what is conditioned, to reconnect with the direction you are choosing rather than the distractions that pull you away from it. Stillness is not the absence of activity. It is the presence of awareness. It is the space where you step back from the constant movement of your mind and observe it, where you notice the patterns that have been guiding you, where you create the distance necessary to make intentional decisions rather than automatic reactions. And this space becomes essential because without it you are constantly responding, constantly adjusting, constantly reacting, but rarely directing. When these four elements are combined, mind, body, mission, and stillness, they create a system that supports transformation, not as a temporary shift, but as a sustained process. And this system does not depend on external conditions. It does not require perfect circumstances. It does not wait for the right time. It operates daily, consistently regardless of what is happening around you. And this is where the concept of rebirth becomes real. Not as a single event, but as a daily decision, a process through which you step away from who you were and step into who you are becoming. Not by declaring it once, but by reinforcing it repeatedly through thought, through action, through discipline, through awareness. And while the changes may not be immediately visible, while the results may take time to appear, something is happening beneath the surface. Something is being constructed. Something is being strengthened. Because identity is not formed in moments of intensity. It is formed in moments of repetition. In the actions you take when you would rather not. In the thoughts you choose when it would be easier to return to old patterns. In the discipline you maintain when there is no immediate reward. And as you continue, as you commit to this process daily, you begin to notice that you are no longer the same person. Not because you have forced change, but because you have built it, layer by layer, decision by decision, until the version of you that once felt distant begins to feel natural. There comes a moment that does not announce itself. A moment that arrives quietly without warning, without ceremony, and yet carries more weight than any external opportunity or event. Because it is the moment where you either continue as you have been or you decide. Not wish, not hope, not consider, but decide. And that decision, though invisible to everyone else, becomes the dividing line between the life you have been repeating and the life you are capable of creating. And the truth is that most people never reach this moment consciously. They drift. They adjust. They improve in small ways, but they never fully decide. And because they never decide, they never fully change. To decide your destiny is not to wait for conditions to align. It is not to wait for confidence to appear. It is not to gather endless information in search of certainty. It is to make a commitment that is not dependent on how you feel today or what results you have produced so far. It is to choose a direction and align your thoughts, your actions, and your identity with that direction consistently, regardless of how long it takes for the external world to reflect it. Most people misunderstand this. They believe that change happens when circumstances improve, when opportunities present themselves, when something external shifts in their favor. But the reality is that nothing changes until you do. And you do not change by accident. You change by decision. A clear, deliberate, internal command that establishes who you are becoming and how you will operate from this point forward. This decision is not comfortable because it requires you to let go of the identity you have been reinforcing. It requires you to release the version of yourself that has been shaped by ease, by doubt, by limitation, and to step into a version that demands more, that expects more, that operates with a level of discipline and clarity that may feel unfamiliar at first. And this is why so many people hesitate. Not because they lack desire, but because they fear what they must leave behind. But what must be understood is that holding on to the old identity is not neutral. It is not safe. It is a choice to remain within the same patterns, the same limits, the same results. And while it may feel easier in the moment, it carries a long-term cost. A cost that shows up as unrealized potential, as opportunities missed, as a life that never fully expands into what it could have been. And this cost is often not recognized until much later, when time has already been spent, when patterns have already been repeated for years. To become unrecognizable is not about external appearance. It is not about dramatic displays of change that others can immediately see. It is about a fundamental shift in how you think, how you act, how you respond. It is about constructing an identity that is so aligned with your purpose that your previous way of living no longer feels natural, no longer feels acceptable. No one no longer feels like an option. This transformation is built through consistency, through the daily application of what you have already begun to understand, through the reinforcement of the thoughts that support your direction, through the discipline of acting even when it is inconvenient, even when it is uncomfortable, even when there is no immediate reward. And over time, this consistency produces something that cannot be faked. It produces a level of alignment between who you are and what you do that becomes visible in everything. You begin to notice that your decisions are no longer driven by hesitation. They are driven by clarity. You no longer wait for permission. You operate with intention. You no longer question whether you should move forward. You focus on how to move forward more effectively. And this shift is not sudden. It is the result of repeated action, repeated thought, repeated commitment that gradually replaces the old patterns with new ones. And as this process continues, something else begins to happen. The things that once held you back lose their influence. The doubts that once felt convincing become less persuasive. The fears that once stopped you become signals that you are moving in the right direction. And this does not mean they disappear. It means they no longer control you because your identity has changed and identity determines response. You are no longer the person who avoids difficulty. You are the person who moves through it. You are no longer the person who waits for certainty. You are the person who creates it through action. You are no longer the person who adapts to circumstances. You are the person who shapes them through consistent effort and clear direction. And this shift, while internal, produces external results that reflect it over time. But this transformation requires something that cannot be replaced. It requires persistence because there will be moments where progress feels slow, where results are not immediately visible, where the effort you are putting in does not yet appear to be producing what you expect. And in those moments, the difference between those who change and those who remain the same is not knowledge. It is commitment. The willingness to continue even when there is no immediate validation because the process itself is building something that cannot be seen at first. It is strengthening your ability to act without hesitation. It is reinforcing your belief through repetition. It is aligning your identity with your direction. And as this alignment becomes stable, results begin to follow. Not because they suddenly appear, but because they are the natural outcome of sustained directed effort. And this is where the true shift becomes undeniable because you are no longer trying to change. You have changed not in a single moment, but through a series of decisions that have been reinforced over time. And the version of you that once felt distant, that once felt out of reach, becomes the version you operate from daily. The question that remains is not whether this is possible, not whether you have the ability, not whether the path exists, because all of that has already been established. The question is whether you will decide whether you will make the commitment that most people avoid. Whether you will take full responsibility for the direction of your life and follow it with consistency regardless of how long it takes, regardless of how it feels in the moment. Because there will be no signal, no perfect time, no external confirmation that tells you to begin. There will only be this moment, and within it the choice to continue as you have been or to step into something different. Something that requires more from you, but also gives more in return. And that choice once made, once committed to, once reinforced through action, becomes the foundation for everything that follows, separating the life that is repeated from the life that is created.